Why don't we just pray, and then we'll look at the text we're going to look at for however long we want to look at it. So let us pray. Oh God, on this morning, we greet you with thanksgiving, but also with the ongoing weariness and emotional strain of social distancing, deep worry about loved ones in frail health, the upheaval in our national life, of course, and then a sense of wonder that we can be connected with a life event in Houston, even as we mourn the passing of a dear loved one here in Pittsburgh. How wondrous life continues to be, even in the midst of the weariness. We pray for all those who are suffering from the virus, those who are mourning the loss of loved ones, for service and healthcare workers like Frank and Maria Guyette and others who tirelessly work to be instruments of your healing. And we just pray for a quick distribution of the vaccine and a sense of hope and a sense of calm, perhaps from Wednesday afternoon forward, looking ahead. Thank you for this time and the privilege to be able to gather and study and guide us, we pray. Amen. I love to read books, and I love that I'm in a congregation that's interested to hear about books that I've read. So I'm going to share the screen and pull up this book. Can you all see it? Beverly Roberts Gaventa, are any of you familiar with her? She is a New Testament scholar. Did she come to Sixth and preach or anything like that? Do any of you know anything about her?
No, I don't think so, but I was interested to see that that she's from the Nazarene tradition, which my husband Reuben grew up in.
Okay.
So I'm real anxious to hear your talk and maybe to read her book.
She's amazing. She's taught at some really exclusive places. I think she's at Princeton now, but she's been widely known as an excellent New Testament scholar. If she grew up in the Nazarene church, what you need to know is that the Nazarenes split off from the Methodists because the Nazarenes didn't feel that the Methodists were holy enough in their practice. They're a very devout, biblically centered group of people. So it's not surprising that there is a lot of good scholars emerge out of that tradition because there's just a deep reverence for the word. And the great thing is that she writes not just for academia, but she writes for a little bit more, public consumption. And so this book is called When in Romans, kind of taking a look at the book. But first, I always feel like as soon as you say the word Paul, it evokes all kinds of things. So what I would like you to do, if you know how to do it in the chat, is to just, when I say the one word Paul, this name, just write in the chat what might be your one word or two word reaction based on anything you've heard about Paul in your life in the church. And you don't have to know much about Paul to have feelings about Paul. So just write them in the chat, anything or a question. You hear the name Paul. What do you think? And do hit, if you've never done the chat, hit everyone and everybody can see your one word reaction. So this is like a Zoom tutorial too. Okay, we've got one so far. Lots of words. I like that. I love Marty. Writing mine in. Marnie, you're not off topic. Wherever we go, we're on topic. We're not at Pitt or Carnegie Mellon. Hard to understand. Okay. Anybody want to unpack a little bit more their phrases or their one words?
I put down the one word change. I
Okay.
really feel at first, there was a time in my life when I was very angry with Paul, but the more I studied Paul, and read the epistles and his life, I realized that I admired him because the person he was at the beginning of my understanding was not the person he was at the end of my understanding of who he was. And so I saw in him a tremendous amount of growth, maybe growth would have been a better word, a tremendous amount of change and growth in who he was, how he expressed himself, what he believed, you know. If you read some of the things, they're just a dichotomy, you know, women be quiet. And then in Romans, he says, listen to these women. So this is a man who has gone through a great amount of change. And that's very comforting because it gives me permission to change, but it gives hope to me for the people who I think need to change.
Berna, I certainly agree with that. I think that many of us have been reading Romans for a long time, and I think we have changed. I put theological depth. I would like to think that as we have gotten older, Sarah, come join us. We learn and read and think and experience more and more. And it's almost a metaphor for scripture, that it was written so long ago in such a different era, but it speaks to everything we do today, to power and equality and love and understanding and conversion. There's no question that in our culture, when I think of Paul, his Damascus conversion is throughout literature. I mean, people talk about that in poetry and literature and news magazines. It's part of, or at least the part of culture that I'm familiar with. It's out there.
Exactly. I mean, this just inordinate influence on all of Western civilization and the world from this one individual. I love what Cliff says, because I think in a lot of homes, devout homes in the Protestant tradition, Paul is held in such a high regard. And so that is definitely something that the church has done, basically held Paul in high regard. There is a place where in First or Second Peter, Peter, the author says, Paul's hard to understand. So Marnie's right on the topic. And also I would agree with Sarah, lots of words. There is some arguments that Paul makes that are so convoluted that New Testament scholars translating the Greek are not even quite sure that they're following the arguments. So all
that's good.
Yeah.
The reason I say that is I find that when I read it, I have to go back and okay, what did that say, and read it again, and not something I can just like one time and own what he's saying.
Yeah, he can get pretty dense at places, so that there's some conjecture as to what in the world was he actually trying to say. And I think that's part of what I think we'll learn in the class, that much of the theology of Paul, he's writing on the fly because he's so busy trying to spread this word. And so he's just kind of, if you know that phrase from General Petraeus, you know, flying the plane as you build it, which is almost the world we're living in with work and academia and life. We're trying to figure out as we're trying to do it. That's what Paul is definitely doing.
Getting the vaccine as it's being invented.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a person of his time, as Carol says. So all of that is kind of, and the notion, strong opinions, definitely Pam has picked up. You know, he's got strong opinions about certain things, but then other things are not things that are weighty to him that we think probably ought to be. And then to go back to Carol or to Verna, there's a schizophrenia there. How can he say women shut up in one place and then acknowledge leadership in another? And that has probably more to do with how the Bible gets put together than what we may know about who Paul was. So, and that'll get explained a little bit. So thank you for being candid about your feelings. I'm going to get back to the share screen here, because sometimes I think, particularly with Paul, we've got to claim that stuff. Otherwise, we can't kind of move on. So you'll find this interesting, because I think, and this is because we have a woman doing the interpreting, we have a whole different, I found a really different understanding of this book that challenged some of my assumptions about what was going on. And I'll try and explain. So this is a statement that would not be surprising to any of us, but it's in her opening comments. What Romans does is confront us with the universal cosmic horizon of the good news. This is really a big picture document. And as if you're in Bible study with me a lot, one of the things I draw attention to is that often the second person pronouns in the New Testament and often in the Old Testament are in the plural and not in the singular. And the reason I say that is because we live in the most individualized, we are the most individualized people that the world has ever known. We think about ourselves first as individuals before we think of ourselves as being parts of groups. And so it's important for her to say, and when we approach the Bible, is that the Bible is not written to you and me personally. It's usually written to congregations, communities, nations. People didn't have the understanding of themselves as being independent and free like we do. So she says salvation is in Romans turns out to involve not just individuals or even groups of people, whether they be the church or other groups, but the liberation of the whole of the created world from the grasp of powers that Paul calls sin and death. So that's hard for us to get a handle on a lot of times, because we don't come and think of ourselves. We were often taught, the Bible is a personal letter that's been written to you. That would have been very foreign to people who first heard these letters. Go ahead, Carol.
A thought occurred that in most languages, the singular you and the plural you, or the familiar you, is a different word. Like in French, you have tu and vous. In English, we don't have that distinction. So maybe there's something in the Anglo-Saxon lexicon that promotes the individuality of the you. And I wouldn't say I fight that, but I frequently, in reading the Bible, because of the way I was raised, I guess, think of it as me.
Yeah, there's no.
Well, I'll just
go ahead.
I'll just add that I lived in Texas for 6.5 years, and not once did I say y'all or fixin' to any of the local. But one of our pastors said he really wished that a Southerner had translated, and he would insert the y'all where he felt needed. And I kind of appreciate that. I think that's what you're talking about, Carol.
It's exactly what Carol's getting at. Because there's no marker grammatically, people who translate the Bible into English are limited, because a lot of times, as Sarah said, when Paul is saying, hey, you Corinthians, and I mean all y'all, because that's what we would say.
Yin's guys.
Yeah. So exactly. That's often the way Paul is speaking. And Beverly Gaventa reminds us of that at the very beginning of her book So Cliff, you put something in the chat. So let me see what that is. What did you say? Say what you said. What does it say?
I hope you can hear me. There's a very famous hypothesis in linguistics called the Whorfian hypothesis. And Carol, what you just said was very interesting. Is it something in the Anglo-Saxon vocabulary? And maybe you were suggesting that we can only say you singular. We can't say you plural. Therefore, we're conditioned. Is that what you're saying? We're conditioned to think in terms of individualism.
That's absolutely right. Yes.
Right.
Uh-huh.
That's one of the most famous hypotheses in linguistics called the Worfian hypothesis, that language creates thought. If we think a certain way, if we speak a certain way, we will think that way. The language creates thought.
That's why I admire multilingual people. They have such a breadth of thinking.
And I agree with you. Now, the other part of this that Sarah and the rest of you have leveled off, we think about it in terms of audience, but what Beverly Gaventa is going to say, don't just change the notion of individuality when you're reading the Bible. Think about it in terms of how it was written. And this is what's really interesting about the beginning of her book, because I always had in my mind, this is the image I have in my mind. Paul gets imprisoned for, preaching the gospel. He gets in trouble with the authorities, and that's when he has time to write. And that writing process is a very solitary process. He's in his prison cell, he's writing, it's all of his stuff. That's often the writing process. But Beverly Gaventa is going to argue very much that it's a peer process. And she does that. I hit my wrong button. Let me go back. We'll get to that, but first of all, I thought that was the next slide, but it's not. But first of all, here's the challenge of Romans and how it's different from other letters. We do know that Paul hasn't yet been to Rome, as he indicates in a couple of places, and that fact seems to influence the letter in several ways. For one thing, Paul cannot appeal to his relationship with these Roman Christians or to their shared experience of the gospel, as he does effusively with the Thessalonians and First Thessalonians. Many of the letters that we read of Paul, he's writing to particular churches he's founded. And so there is a deep relationship already there, but it's not the case here. Paul cannot appeal to any authority he has as the one who first preached the gospel to them, as he does in Galatians and Corinthians. So he has to tread more carefully. And that also has an effect on the letter that she wants to name at the very beginning in the first couple of chapters. But here's where it gets interesting. Go ahead.
Who founded the church in Rome? Is that Peter?
We don't know. We do not know. We have no idea.
Half of Christendom thinks it was Peter, I believe.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of a folklore tradition, but we have no information. And what we learn pretty quickly, and this is probably because the church was in the primary, the foundational imperial city of the empire, Rome. What we learn is that the church in Rome quickly had power. We learned this from a letter called the First Letter of Clement, which is a book that did not get into the New Testament. It's a letter that Clement writes to the Corinthian church, which has had a lot of trouble from the Roman church, basically saying that the congregational meeting you had where you got rid of all your elders, you need to reinstate them. It's kind of like if we at Sixth Presbyterian Church didn't like our session, decided to get rid of them all, and East Liberty comes knocking on our door and says, we're East Liberty, put those elders back in place. So the Roman church had a lot of power. But anyway, there's these words.
I'm laughing because I think our church would react very strongly to East Liberty coming in and telling us what to do.
As would any Presbyterian church, but some, it's kind of like George Orwell. We're all equal, but some are more equal than others, correct? So anyway, there's this seemingly innocuous parting that Paul offers at the end of the letter. He writes this: I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. Kind of a throwaway line. We don't think it's any big deal, but Gaventa wants to tell us some things about the text. First, Phoebe is our sister. So she's from a congregation nearby. And Corinth, by the way, the port city of Corinth, just so you know, it was kind of a boom town. Didn't exist 100 years before Paul got there, but the Roman Empire built a canal, and so it became a port city. So Paul and Phoebe were probably in the vicinity of Corinth when the letter is written. They've got a couple of boat rides. It's going to be a little bit of a journey. But she's a diakonos, from which we get our word deacon, and a prostatis, a benefactor. Diakonos is a term that Paul applies to Jesus Christ and to himself in the letter. So by Paul, it looks offhanded, a deacon, he's just mentioning, oh, Phoebe's a deacon. Well, it's actually a pretty big thing. She's got leadership and gravitas in the fledgling, growing Christian movement. She's got some charismatic leadership. She's important. And she's a prostatis. It can be assumed that she has her own funds, because if she were married, Paul would have referred to her husband. And we'll see this often in Paul, how he looks to rich women who have leadership gifts to support his ministry, but also to augment it and spread it. So don't know if there's any comments at this point about any of that, but this here is where there's a lot of biographical information to suggest that this Paul who said women ought to shut up is not really the Paul in practice. Carol, you were going to say something?
Well, again, your comment about her having her own funds, she probably did not inherit those from her father, I would think. So from what's the source of her funds? Had she been married and
Widowed.
left?
She would have been widowed.
She would have been widowed and would have had those.
And would have had these funds. And so
without children, because the children would have received, or the sons would have received.
Yeah, so more than likely childless and a widow. So she's got great wealth, which gives her some leverage, but she doesn't have any status in that culture given the patriarchy. And so the appeal of the gospel message is, I can come to a place and be among a sense of people and have a sense of worth and have a vocation. You need to think about, we're just living in a recent time where women have professional life in our own culture, right? But she doesn't have that outlet, but she has money and she could do something with it. Now, what's interesting about this, so what, go ahead, somebody else wanted to speak?
Me again, so sorry, but this is just so fascinating to me. I'm so impressed with the role that Black women are playing in our current culture. It's just, it's so powerful. I don't want to hear any more from Black rappers, male rappers. I want to hear from these smart, active women. They're just teaching us so much.
And why is that significant? If only white votes would have been counted in the last election, President Trump would have had a second term. So we're thinking about what activism people have done, people of color have done to really kind of change that. Okay, I'm getting to the so what. It took me a while, but I think this is kind of cool to me personally. Okay, so she's she has she has wealth and she's considered to be a leader. She's demonstrated leadership. So Gaventa says we need to think about the writing of the letter of Romans differently. The explicitness of the introduction leads scholars like Gaventa to surmise that she is not only the bearer of the letter, she didn't only carry the letter to Rome, but she's its first interpreter. Paul would not have had her carry the letter to the Roman church if she could not understand its content and represent it. She also would have read it to the congregation. Remember, these letters are often read in the worship service to the congregation. There would be word that got out. There's a letter coming from our founder, Paul. That's not the case in Rome, but in the other churches. And so when we gather on Sunday morning to celebrate the Lord's Supper and the resurrection of Jesus, we're going to read the letter from our founder. That Phoebe would have been the spokesperson. So, and then Gaventa also dares to suggest, as the guest of Gaius's house in Corinth, where Paul was staying before he got to Rome, Paul would have dictated the letter and read it aloud in Gaius's household for feedback and revision. And this is something that I really wasn't aware of, but other scholars support. Writing was not a solitary process. Hence, Phoebe was more than likely an editor of the final version of the letter. And that's kind of a, you know, I'm a preacher. I love looking at scripture. So that's a wow moment for me. That may not be a big deal, but I mean, how are research documents compiled? I'm going to go to Marnie. What's the academic process for putting together something? Is it, I'm thinking that this is describing something that looks more like a collaborative process in the academic field than what I grew up thinking, which is Paul wrote these letters by himself. Can you offer any insight at this point?
I mean, I can just say in academia, at least where I am in health, which is different from statistics, you know, there's usually a first author who writes everything, who distributes it to all of the co-authors. All of the co-authors have comments. It goes back to the first author who incorporates them. It goes back to the other authors to approve. Then it goes to a journal. The journal will give it to 3 to 5 reviewers. Those reviewers will all comment. It'll go back to the first author. Then there'll be recommendations for changes to get it published. The first author changes it, sends it to all of the co-authors for approval, sends it back to the editor, and that process can happen a couple times.
Well, Gaventa is arguing that's much more the process of this letter than we previously surmised, rather than thinking Paul's writing this in isolation. It's a community process. And he has to, because he can't get there yet, and he isn't the founder, he has no authority. He has to send somebody who's highly regarded in the Roman Church, who also knows the contents of the letter, to be the first one to talk about, to read the letter and talk about it. So Phoebe is, I mean, she's got a much greater place of power. I mean, I think of her as kind of, what could we call her? You know, President Obama had certain people who would get out on the Sunday morning talk shows to, you know, to explain the policy.
Susan Rice, for example.
Susan Rice, a Susan Rice. A bad example is that she's a Kellyanne Conway. I don't want to leave that image in your mind, so let's move on, because we don't want to hear from her any longer. So this is what Gaventa is arguing, that she really has a much more prominent place. And so I think, wow, that's kind of cool, because it speaks to either Paul's, you know, security as a male, or it speaks to just how people were just kind of doing this as they were going along.
Vincent is so interesting in all of our books and classes about women of the Bible. You never hear about Phoebe.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And this, and Beverly's arguing that she's got another you know, she's got a much more prominent place. Now, she goes into the first couple chapters talking about what are the big hopes and concerns about the letter. Is it primarily about Jerusalem? Well, what do you mean? Jerusalem's not even mentioned. But I find this interesting. You may find this as not being all that interesting. Paul's about to leave for the holy city, and he's going to deliver to Christians in Jerusalem funds he's collected from richer Gentile churches in Macedonia and Achaia. Remember that Jerusalem and Palestine at this point, that Rome has come in, destroyed the temple, pretty much taken over and completely occupied Palestine. And so the economic reality for people at that point is very grim, not only in the capital city of Jerusalem, but out in the hinterlands. And so one of the things that Paul does is that he goes to the rest of the Greco-Roman world, which is booming, and he goes to those churches and he collects funds so that he can provide relief to the Jerusalem church. Now, he doesn't just do that out of altruism. He does that because there are people in Jerusalem that are questioning the message and the proclamation that he's proclaiming out in the hinterlands. You know, he's making this crazy assertion that all these Gentiles that are suddenly flocking to his preaching and founding these churches are not being indoctrinated in Judaism. They're not practicing some basic things that are central to Judaism. For example, circumcision, following the kosher dietary laws, keeping Sabbath, and following the instruction in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. And so one of the things that's lifted up, and I asked some of you who came on, if you want to find this reference in chapter 15, verse 32. This is where Paul makes the appeal. Paul writes in chapter 15, I appeal to you all of you Yinzers, brothers and sisters, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit of God, to join me in earnest prayer to God on my behalf, that I may be rescued from the unbelievers in Judea, and that my ministry to Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints, so that by God's will I may come to you with joy and be refreshed in your company. See, the problem is that there's some people back in Jerusalem that feel that Paul is not only being unorthodox in his preaching and his theology, but that he is a heretic. And even though he's having a lot of success, all kinds of Gentiles are flocking to his message, he's not preaching the true religion. And so Paul is coming to Rome when it's a rich church in order to secure some more funds to help those people who are starving in Jerusalem, and perhaps get them to change their feelings about what he's doing and what he's saying out in the hinterlands. Does any of that make sense? Am I making sense? Okay, so that may be one of the objectives, Gaventa says, is that he's really trying to fight a rearguard action with those who are his detractors back in Jerusalem. Could the issue be, oops, I hit too many. Is it Spain?
It kind of feels,
Go ahead.
It kind of feels like all the companies that are saying they're not going to fund Trump anymore, or his things, however.
Well, money's always a leverage to get people to do what they want, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is the main issue Spain, Beverly says. Remember, there's language you may remember from having read this book, that Paul wants to get to Spain. As far as the world was known at that time, the farthest west you could go was Spain, right? And then you run into the Atlantic Ocean. And Paul has this deep desire that the gospel be spread, and his concern, and why? Well, his concern is much like what we experience from evangelicals today. They're afraid that if people don't get a chance to hear the gospel and respond to it favorably, they're going to go to hell. And so Paul's anxious to get as far and wide while he has life and breath, but he needs money in order to keep up that missionary activity. And so he's hoping to go to Rome to get some money so that he can be sent on to Spain, which is where he wants to go. And so we don't have any knowledge if he ever got there. Most people think that he ended up losing his life in Rome with one of the waves of persecution that came upon Roman people. And this is all background. You may say, so what to this? So let's not spend any more time with it. Or is the issue in Rome itself? Beverly says, most scholars believe that the concerns that prompt the letter are concerns that originate in Rome. One argument is that Paul is aware of conflict at Rome between Gentile and Jewish believers. Others have suggested that the Jewish Christian missionaries who proved problematic to Paul in Galatians are on their way to Rome, where they will again insist that Gentiles abide by Jewish law, or that the conflict in Galatia has already reached the Roman Church and they have poisoned the arrival of Paul with claims that he has abandoned the Jewish tradition. And so that's one of the reasons he wants to write the letter. Somebody rang the bell who's going to be leading worship, so I need to leave for a minute to let them in, and I'll be back. So you can talk among yourselves.
So when did the anti-Semitism set in the Christian church? Quickly?
Thanks.
So when do you think the anti-Semitism set in the Christian church? Is that the origin of that?
I just got back. What was your question?
When did anti-Semitism become so endemic to the Christian church?
Well, it actually comes, the Gospels are written later than these letters. It actually comes later. Because we see the anti-Semitic material that's in the Gospels. That's a big question. I'm going to give you a short answer. So most of that comes later as as people get tired of the fledgling Christian people in synagogues that are claiming that Jesus is the Messiah, the tensions rise and vitriol rises and it poisons and it becomes polarized. And then you know what happens with polarization, don't we?
We see it.
Yeah, we tend to, rather than having connections with people we're in conflict with, we tend to allow caricatures and misrepresentations of them come to the fore, and we tend to demonize those to whom we're opposed. And that definitely happens on both sides, on the Jewish side and on the Christian side. There's nothing like fights between siblings. Those of you who are raising children know? Correct?
It gets better, folks.
We hope. Fights to the death. Okay, let's keep going. And what happened? What did I do? Oh, there's always that panic moment.
I think you're at the end of the slideshow. Just go page up or down.
I don't think I am. I didn't think I was, but maybe I am. Well, it didn't happen. Why it's frozen here, just a second.
There you go.
Is it up there? Okay. Yeah, I guess I am at the end of it. All right. So basically, this is the background kind of thing. But to kind of summarize, thinking about this as a communal process of writing and as more of a back and forth kind of discussion, not only in the letter, but what happens later, is, I think, an important way that faith arises. It arises from us sharing our particular experiences of what life is like with other people, and then figuring out some things. Language informs that. We only think in the concepts and in the language structures we have, as Cliff said, but we also just take our experience and try and say, based on my experience, this is how I understand my spirituality. Based on the life experiences I've had, both good and bad. And Paul is trying to attempt to deal with his particular situation in community with others and saying, these are the things that I think are really, really important to remember. And what he'll begin to say is that there are things going on that are much more powerful and bigger than our own individual and communal choices in this letter. And think about, what are the forces that are shaping you and I right now that we have no choice about, but that we just live in?
How much time do you have?
Well, just start. What are the things?
COVID.
Yeah.
We can't, COVID is a big thing.
Yeah,
division.
Yeah, I mean, we can't. The way that now, the explosion of information we have at our hands constantly.
Overwhelming. Incomprehension.
So he's going to talk about, and I love that Kate DeVoli talked about this right before I talked about it last week in preaching. But one of the things the New Testament is very aware of is that there are systems and there are structures, what they call power and principalities, that have a great deal of influence upon our communal and individual life, that are just a given that we have to navigate. Which really, I think, tempers this notion of, I've had to come to grips with, in my own life is, I was taught you can be anything that you want to be. And if you just work hard enough, you'll get to a certain place. And that's important.
Life happy.
That's valuable. It's important. We teach our children that, but then we run into life.
I mentioned that the youngest member, Sarah, the youngest member of our group is, you expressed a concern. How much time do we have left? I'm 75. I should be the one saying that. In fact, I'm
No,
thinking
I
about
was, Cliff, I was asking how much time do you have to hear the things that are shaping my existence today?
I think
Share
that's right.
with us, Sarah. Share with us. What are
Sounds
the
good.
things in your life that are impacting?
Oh, I mean, let's say every norm that we've known has been changed. Okay, we're still on the same schedule, but we're doing everything different. The social interactions that are so healthy for us cannot happen. I find in my work that with the community, I'm constantly fighting the city because there's so little funds to do the right thing, that the city is just doing stupid things that kind of fit the book but don't make anything better. They make it even more troublesome. And these are just being influenced by the economic situation that we have, and our markets and our economy are not acting the way that we know how to study them. And that's making business decisions much different than what they were. People's lives are just, people are working so hard for nothing.
Mhm.
It's like the gaps are widening, and that's causing different tensions. And those are some of the things that I'm feeling.
But it's so important to be aware of those in order to have a more realistic, perspective on, what agency I have to be able to do some of those things. We can do a little bit about, but a lot of what you talked about, I heard you say, I don't have any leverage or power or access or agency to do much about some of those things, or I continually am beating my head against the wall, running up against things where I'm stopped. So,
Yeah,
Well,
this
now,
week
I always
I've
think about
said,
this.
go ahead, Sarah, and then Cliff.
I was just saying that this week, I don't know how many times I've said on how many different topics, I've got one more fight left. I'm going to fight this one more time. And then I go back because it's not right. And I can't stop because I don't want to leave it. I want to leave it better. That's.
You keep on fighting.
Good for you, because that's a courageous but a very difficult decision.
Well, my one of
Go ahead, Cliff.
the woman I most admire in the world is my wife, and she's part of a grassroots organization that's fighting pipelines and fracking and global warming. And it's this tiny group of people, 5 or 6 people, all of whom are retired school teachers and librarians. And they don't give up. And somebody said, never worry about the power of a small group of dedicated citizens to change the course of history. Don't worry about that. It's the only thing that ever has.
Margaret Mead's favorite comment. But to finish up, because I do need to go down for the live stream just at this point, it's really important for us to keep giving ourselves to things that are beyond us, that are going to outlast us, that we're not going to see the results of. And for those of us who are older on the call, we have more of our life behind us. We are now at that point where we are giving ourselves to things and trying to, give ourselves to things, and we won't necessarily see the fruits of our labors. And so in some respects, that's what's happening for Paul and Phoebe, instructing this Roman church. We ought to keep that in mind as we look ahead. So we're going to take a look at the book over the next 2 or 3 weeks. You're welcome to come. You don't have to read anything ahead of time. Mainly our discussion is the main driver of this. And so it's good to be with you. I'm going to go. You can keep going on the Zoom if you want, but I've got to go down and get my costume on and lead worship. But good to see you. Thanks.
See
Thanks,
you
Vincent.
soon. Thank you.
Thank you.